so much, ladies. I know this is a tad surprising, but there has never been a time in my life where I have been considered cool. I never dressed cool. I never hung out with, I was never allowed to hang out with any cool people. Not by my parents, but by them. And so I didn't dress cool. I didn't hang out with cool people. And among other things, I never even talked cool, because if you're cool, there's phrases in particular eras that you're likely to pick up and to be using that lingo as well. For me, though, this is what it looked like. When I was in junior high school, I had a teacher. Her name was Mrs. Boyd, and Mrs. Boyd could not pronounce the word student. She called us scrutants. And so you would hear me regularly calling people scrutants because I was not cool. Had another teacher that was always threatening people with a 4 in conduct, which was the worst that you could possibly get. You could have a good grade, but a bad conduct grade. And she was always threatening people with her 4, and so I would threaten people with a 4. It was also during this era that even the show had already aired and had disappeared for a period of years, but the Dukes of Hazzard came back on TV, and I was stoked. And so for, I'd say, probably more than a year, I almost became Roscoe P. Coltrane. And I was using words like freeze and cuff 'em and stuff 'em and hot pursuit and all. I know you're wondering, how was I single so long? And what a victory that Caroline won when she got this trophy. But anyway, those weren't any of the cool phrases, surprisingly, that were being used during those eras. But the reality is, in virtually every age, there are some phrases that are very popular, that are kind of cool, that are widely used. For example, those of you that remember back in the 50s, I looked up some of the phrases that began to become popular during some of the different decades. In the 50s, cruising for a bruising, knuckle sandwich, daddy-o, burn rubber, party pooper, and ankle biter. All of those showed up in the 50s. In the 60s, it was more stuff like groovy and far out of sight, and dig it, lay it on me, and bummer. In the 70s, disco was the rage, and you would hear things like, and you probably might have said this morning, "Oh, Suki, Suki." Anyway, you catch my drift. That also showed up. Jeepers Creepers, don't be such a spaz. And that, I thought it was a little bit later, but that's when Psych showed up. Remember when you were just Psych joking? Anyway, in the 80s, we started using words like dude. And if someone was clueless, you might refer to them as a space cadet. And it was also during this era that people started using the word like all the like time. And that led to another phrase that came around in the 80s, Valley Girl. Because Valley Girls like, oh my goodness, talk like this like all the time, okay? In the 90s, we got introduced to phrases like going postal. You know it. What's crack-a-lackin'? Booyah. Anything that I say today that you might like, you could use that one, booyah. Hasta la vista, baby. And if it's really good, swing. But the truth is, in every era, there are these phrases that become popular that almost define particular ages and stages. But these phrases, by and large, are used by adolescents and young adults. They're the ones that kind of determine what's popular or cool or in culture, or the in stuff in our culture. Hold that for just a moment, though, and consider this. We started last week a series where we're looking at the life of Moses, but not just walking through the life of Moses, but specifically thinking about his experience through the reality and hopefully through the understanding that our lives very much are lived in stages. And there are childhood stages and adolescence and young adult, and there's the senior stage. There's all these different stages that are characterized not hopefully just by our experience and going through them it is the case that God wants us to grow through them. And we're thinking about not just the seasons of life, but also the seasons of our walk with God. And as it is that there is childhood and infancy in our physical life, it's also the case that in your walk with God, there is this baby stage where hopefully you begin to grow and mature, and you want to reach adulthood, you want to reach maturity in your walk with the Lord. But back to what we started with was this notion that in every age and stage there are some phrases, in particular used by adolescents, that are kind of descriptive of that stage. And it is the case that those that are in the adolescent phase of spiritual development, there are some phrases that they are prone to use. And if perhaps you're in that stage, it's entirely possible that you may be finding yourself saying some things like we're going to consider today. And so based on what we see in the life of Moses, it helps us answer the question we want to think about today, which is this: what are some of the things likely to be said by those who are spiritual adolescents? What are some of the things that are likely to be said by those who are spiritual adolescents? We see that the answer to that beginning in the 2nd chapter of Exodus, beginning with verse 11. There we read this: that years later, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his own people and observed their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his people. Looking all around and seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian dead and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting, and he asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you attacking your neighbor?" He replied, "Who made you a commander and judge over us? Are you planning to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses became afraid and thought, "What I did is certainly known." When Pharaoh heard about this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. We're going to see what follows there, but that snippet of Scripture really helps answer the question for us today, which again is this: what are some of the things that are likely to be said by those in the stage, spiritually speaking, of adolescence? I think what we see based on the life of Moses here, the first thing they're prone to say is this: no one will ever know. So that which I am doing, no one will ever know. Now, so that we're on the same page, remember last week we started with the start of Moses' life, and there is this edict by the Pharaoh where all Hebrew male children, if any Hebrew son is born, they're to be tossed into the river to be drowned. They're trying to control the population. And you remember that Moses' mother desperately doesn't want to do this. She gives birth to this little boy, and for 3 months she hides him, does everything that she possibly can to safeguard his well-being, but it gets to the point where he can't be hidden any longer. And not knowing what else to do, she makes this little raft, puts her little baby in it, and sends him literally down the river with the hope that somehow, some way, this story is going to have a happy ending. She didn't know what was going to happen, but you recall that the Pharaoh's daughter happened to be out bathing in the river and sees this raft come by, discovers there's a child in it, and winds up taking this little boy out, discovering it's one of the Hebrews, and long story short, has this own child, his mother, nurse him for a period of years, where when we finished the first part of chapter 2, it says that when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So he's raised in the Pharaoh's house as essentially the son of the Pharaoh's daughter, and she's the one that gave him the name Moses, because that name means drawn out of water. Now, we get to verse 11, we're told that Moses had grown up at this point. Now, based on what Stephen says in Acts chapter 7, that gives us indication as to how old Moses is at this point. He is, we believe, roughly 40 years old. And so the span of space between verse 8 and verse 11 is, or at the end of verse 10 and verse 11 is 40 years old. You say, well, that's not an adolescent. But it is the case that Moses lives to be 120 years old, and so that adolescent stage probably went a little further. But when you think about the experience of adolescence, physically there are a lot of big changes that are going on. It's almost as if your brain is getting, not almost as if, it is rewiring as you are growing and developing, and among other things, you're experiencing physical changes, but also you're beginning to sprout some wings, and you're trying to begin to experience some independence. It's also a stage where you think that you know a great deal, when in truth you know. Anyway, no offense. But your perception of what you know and what you actually know, there's a big distance between the two. I believe in truth that this characterizes where Moses is, at least in terms of his spiritual development. He is experiencing independence, and what he thinks he knows, what he believes that he has a grasp on, I believe is far more than he actually possesses a hold and a grasp on. And so what he does is that he sees that his people, and even though he was raised in an Egyptian home, even though he was essentially raised in wonderfully posh circumstances, effectively as a grandchild of the Pharaoh, he knows he's not an Egyptian, he's a Hebrew. And how fully he knows all this, what all he knows, we're not told those details, but he knows, I am not one of them. He knows also that his people are not free in Egyptian society and culture, that they're operating as slaves. And all of this work is going on, and it's forced labor. They're baking bricks, they're building pyramids, they're doing all this very difficult work. And we're told that he sees an Egyptian striking a Hebrew. And in fact, it says one of his own people. Now, certainly this is, we don't want to condone or endorse slavery at all, but the manner in which he's treating him, whether there was something that provoked this, we don't know. But it does seem that Moses observes the fact that one of his own people has been struck by an Egyptian, and he is incensed by this. Whether it was warranted in any fashion, we have no idea. But Moses is ticked by this. In fact, he is so furious with this, the only decent response, the only appropriate response he thinks is this: I'm going to kill that dude. And so we're told, verse 12, looking all around and seeing no one, that's when he acted. Now, you may imagine that this occurs out in the middle of nowhere, but this could have very possibly occurred where other people were around, maybe back even in town, perhaps in the city. But Moses looks and he sees, it appears that no one is paying any attention. No one is actually seeing me. And we're told that he struck this Egyptian dead. The word that's used there that's translated struck is one that typically means to strike with a weapon, generally in battle. And so a club, a stick of some sort, he hits this Egyptian with, and he mortally wounds him, and he's dead. Now, does Moses know that he is doing something that is wrong? I think absolutely he knows that he's doing something that he shouldn't be doing, that he is operating out of bounds, that he is responding in a way that's not up to him, and he is intentionally taking a life, and he is doing so in a manner that is absolutely out of bounds. He knows this because he first of all decides, I want to act when no one else can see this. Beyond that, when he kills this man, what happens? Well, the next thing that he does is that he goes and he hides this body. He doesn't go to the Pharaoh staff, people that he would have known, people he would have had a personal relationship with, and said, listen, one of the Egyptians was acting inappropriately, and he was abusive to this Hebrew, and what he was doing was, in defense of this man, I killed this Egyptian. He doesn't do that at all. Instead, he makes sure that no one is looking, and then what he does, he seeks to hide and to cover up. This tells us in very clear terms, Moses knew what he was doing was wrong, and it also tells us that Moses thought no one will have any idea. As that happens, the next day he observes there's two Hebrews fighting, and there's one that clearly is a perpetrator. Somebody has instigated this. And he goes, as he sees them fighting, and he says, guys, what are you doing? And he goes to the one that started this, and he's like, what's the matter with you? Why are you treating your own countrymen like this? Why are you treating your own people like this? And so he responds with this question: who made you a commander, or who made you judge over us? I mean, is that the gig that you have now? And just out of curiosity, are you going to treat me like you did that Egyptian? At this point, Moses knows there are no secrets. At this point, Moses realizes that what he has done is absolutely known. And even though he thought there was no one who was observing, it was seen and it was known. One of the realities is this, that if you are experiencing, whether it's physical adolescence, but in particular spiritual adolescence, one of the things that you do is that you think some things that are not actually correct. Your perception of how things are and how they actually are, there tends to be distance between them. And one of the things that characterizes spiritual adolescence is this thought: I can do stuff where people won't know. I can operate in ways where there is impunity. I can operate in ways where there is secrecy. And if nobody knows, then I can act how it is that I please, and I can do so without experiencing consequence. And so why is he acting this way? Why does Moses make these decisions and choices? Because he's telling himself, no one will ever know. One of the reasons I believe that God has led us as his followers, not just to follow him in isolation, but to follow him in community, in connection with other followers, with other believers. One of the reasons I think that he makes us spiritual kin and family is because God knows this: we need each other. We need each other for a variety of reasons, but one of the things that we need each other for is this: in the absence of accountability and oversight, we will do things that we absolutely should not. And if we operate with the awareness that someone is paying attention, we tend to operate in bounds. My friend Alan, his parents for years own a dry cleaners, and over the years that I have known him, there were a few times that I would go down there, sometimes just to visit. There were a few times even that I helped out. And their dry cleaners was an old gas station. And where you would come in to drop your clothes off, a little small area. It had a counter and a cash register, and they would take clothes in and then give them back in that same small area. But that was separated from the rest of the space where the actual work was going on, where the clothes sorting was going on, where all this stuff was getting bagged and tagged and all that stuff. Anyway, as I go in there, I notice that just above the cash register, up to the right on the wall, there is a camera, and it's got a red light on it. And I said to Alan, I said, y'all have a TV camera in the back where you can see what's going on? He said, oh, that thing's not real. I was like, what? It's got a red light on it. He said, oh, it just plugs in and it causes the red light to go on. I'm like, well, what's the use? What stands to reason? You know why they did that. If we think that someone is watching, what do? We tend to act better, don't we? We tend not to do things that we know are out of bounds. We tend to do things that we know are in keeping with the right. But Moses is operating, if nobody sees me, nobody knows, then I can do this. Why is that a mark of spiritual adolescence? Why is that a mark of lacking or absent maturity? Because of this. The more mature that you get in your walk with God, the more it is that you understand, I absolutely benefit from operating in close proximity to others and having others see in my life and having others operate see how it is that I operate. And maturity will lead you to go towards accountability and oversight, and immaturity will lead you to pursue operating in the absence of it. One of the marks of spiritual adolescence is this thought: I can operate in ways where no one will know. No one will ever have any idea. And when that's the case, you're going to find yourself, unfortunately, making some very regrettable decisions. There's something else that Moses said that others, I think, that in spiritual adolescence do as well, and that's this. They tell themselves, that will never happen again. That will never happen again. Some of you maybe say that when you look at your marriage license, but he says that will never happen again. Moses at this point has killed this Egyptian. He realizes what I have done. He knows that it's wrong, but now he also knows that it has been discovered. And so he is aware that his own countrymen know it, that these other Hebrews know it. But when you get to verse 15, we're told that Pharaoh hears about this. This is just a reminder to us that there really are no secrets. There just aren't. I mean, we're seeing that where U.S. assessment of Ukrainian battle plans is showing up on gaming websites. There are no secrets. And what Moses has done, not only do his own countrymen know this, but Pharaoh even hears about this, and he is incensed. In fact, he decides, I want to kill Moses for what he has done to one of our people, what he's done to one of my people. This is a personal affront to him, not just as the Pharaoh, but as an Egyptian. And at this point, Moses leaves. We're told that he goes down to Midian, and he sits down by a well. Midian is on the eastern side of what we know today as the Sinai Peninsula. Where Moses went is an area that we would know today as Saudi Arabia. It is a long walk. It is a long distance from where the Pharaoh was, and he's gone there because he knows, I have been found out. It is known what I have done. There are no secrets, and I am scared. And so he goes there. Verse 16 begins to describe that he meets this woman, and long story short, they start a family. And he operates there in Midian. In Acts chapter 7, we read a more full description than we see here in Exodus of what transpires. Stephen describes this. When Pharaoh heard about what Moses had done, we're told that Moses fled and became an exile in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai and the flame of a burning bush. You say, well, why did you read that to us? Very simply, because it tells us how long Moses was in Midian. 40 years. I mean, I'm 48. That's the vast majority of my life. 40 years that Moses spends in Midian. If you look in your Bibles, we're reading this in Acts chapter 2. You see chapter 3 starts, it says, Moses and the burning bush. So what Stephen was talking about, the distance between the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of chapter 3 is 4 entire decades. And what is Moses doing? Well, he's just living. He's just going through the routine. He's just doing his thing. He's a husband, he's a father, he's a worker of some sort, and he's just living. Does God do anything with him for 40 years? 4 whole decades pass before God does something with Moses. When God speaks to him in chapter 3 and reveals to him, listen, Moses, I've got some real significant plans for you, and I'm ready to use you in a meaningful way. When God begins to do this, Moses, though we're not told this, is probably thinking, you know what? I hate that all that time was lost. In fact, when Moses is used by God to go to the Pharaoh, he's 80 years old. You've got to think that Moses was thinking, oh my goodness, I hate that all of that time was squandered, all that time was lost, all those decades were wasted, where all this usefulness that I could have had, I didn't have because of my disobedience. All that wasted time because of the bad, foolish decision that I made thinking I can act with impunity. No one else will know. Others will have no idea, so I can do as I please, even to do the wrong things. And because of that, 4 decades pass. We're not told this, and this is just Michael's speculation, but I believe it's reasonable speculation, that Moses probably told himself after 40 years have gone by, 4 decades are essentially in the trash can, he probably told himself, I am never, ever, ever going to do something so stupid as to waste 40 years of my life again. I'm never going to act so dumb and foolish as I did back when I killed that Egyptian. I will never, ever, 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 ever do something so dumb where I'm going to waste, because of my choices, 40 years. That'll never, ever, ever happen again. Well, if you're familiar with how the story of Moses unfolds, you know, once they finally get to the promised land, they send the spies in. 10 of the 12 come back and say, listen, there's no way that we can take this. 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, said, listen, with God's help, we can do this. And it seems that not only, it's clear that not only the people, but it seems that Moses also yields to the minority report. When they say these people are giants, there's no way that we can take this. And do you remember what happens at that point? They wander in the wilderness for how long? 40 years. When Moses dies, he is 120 years old, and he wastes 80 years of it because of his foolish decisions. Why does he make another regrettable decision that's going to cost him another 40 years? I believe because he told himself, I will never, ever, ever do something so dumb where it's going to cost me like that. I'm going to tell myself that will never happen again. And if we tell ourselves that will never happen again, that certainly makes sure that it doesn't happen, doesn't it? Let me give you an example. These are my church keys. And actually, this is you need to get one of these, this little pen, that's very helpful. But anyway, these are my church keys. I keep them on a separate key ring from any of my other sets of keys. And when I come to the church on Sunday mornings, one of the things that I do is to take my car keys out and I'll set them on my desk. But there have been some instances where I grab the wrong set and I will throw my church keys on the desk. And then when I leave my office, I shut the door and then I'm locked out. Fortunately, I keep a key to my office in the safe. And so then I can, if I lock myself out, I can go let myself back in. This has been, within the last couple of years, what I just described happened. I grabbed the wrong set. I've locked myself out. It's important for me to get back in because my Bible and my notes are in there. And so I like to have those when I preach. And so I need to get back in there. So I go to the safe, I get my key out, and I go in there. I unlock the door, I take the key back, put it back in the safe, and I tell myself, not going to do that again. On that Sunday, I don't know what happened. Maybe I went something over at the fellowship hall. I shut the door again, and I go back later, and I'm locked out of my office. I repeat this. I go get the key out of the safe, let myself in, go put the key back in the safe, and I tell myself, that will not happen again. Before the Lord, I did it a third time on the same Sunday. 3 times in one morning, I locked myself out of the office. And I told myself, that's not going to happen. Michael, you dummy, you're never going to do that again. And I did it another 2 times. Listen, telling yourself that it's never going to happen again is absolutely insufficient. And in truth, it's a mark of adolescence, spiritual adolescence, when you say, I'm just declaring it will never happen again. Declaring something to be so, pledging that something is going to be so, is not going to change anything. That's why Paul tells us this in Corinthians. He says, let the one who thinks he stands take heed or be careful lest he fall. What's the difference between saying I'm taking heed and I'm being careful versus I'm declaring that it's not going to happen again? Well, in one case, I'm actually doing something. I am operating intentionally. I am operating cautiously. I'm telling myself I am going to intentionally be careful so that I do not repeat that same decision. It seems that Moses just told himself, I'll never, ever do something so stupid to waste another 40 years. And he finds himself at 80 years of life making another regretful decision that cost him another entire 4 decades. Why? Because he said, I'll never do something like that again. But then he did. Why is it important for us to not say that'll never happen? Because when we say that'll never happen, what we do is we leave that door unlocked. We remove the guard from that entrance, and we tell ourselves, that's fine. That area of my life is perfectly fine. And when you leave that gate, when you leave that door, when you leave that entrance unguarded, you can rest assured that the enemy is going to come after you in that place. Moses told himself that'll never happen, but then it did. But in truth, these are marks, ultimately, of spiritual adolescence. You know, in every generation, there are cool things that those in that season of life are saying. And I don't know exactly what, and the years will tell us what the cool things that are being said right now are in a few years. but something that has always been the case for those who are in their adolescence spiritually. They tell themselves, I can operate where no one will know, and if I do make a mistake, I can tell myself that'll never happen again, discovering, unfortunately, later that both of those are false assumptions. So what do you do with this? Where does this intersect you in your life? Maybe it is that you hear this morning and you say, you know what? I may not want to advertise this. I may not want to have my picture up on the screen next to these statements, but truth be told, that's kind of how I've been operating. If that's the case, let me just tell you, that's kind of giving you a status assessment. This is kind of where you are in your walk with God. And I'm not saying that you should celebrate that, but I think you need to own it and say, this is where I am. This is where I am. But then ask yourself this, is that where I want to remain? Or is it that I want to grow? Is it that I want to mature? We all go through adolescence. The question is, are you going to stay there? Will you bow your heads with me?